Welcome back to Panda's Nightmares, where we dive into the darkest corners of the human experience. Tonight, we're exploring something truly unsettling, the creepiest, most bone-chilling things people have ever read online that claim to be true. These are the stories that leave you staring at your screen, questioning reality, and wondering if you'll ever sleep peacefully again. Before we begin, I want to share something personal. I'm currently raising funds for my dad's medical treatment, and every bit of support helps. If you'd like to contribute, the GoFundMe link is in the description below. Thank you for your kindness. And now, let's step into the eerie and unexplainable. Story 1. This happened when I was about 4 or 5 years old, shortly after my parents had separated. My mum was living in a small 2-bedroom apartment. I had my own room, but I often slept in her bed whenever I stayed with her. Our bedrooms were at the end of a hallway, directly across from each other. It was summertime, and my mum had her bedroom window open. It was right behind the bed, above the headboard, letting in the warm night air. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up and sat up in bed. I noticed our cat sitting in the doorway to my mum's room, staring into the hallway. It was strange, because he was a huge snuggler and usually stayed curled up with us. As I watched, the cat slowly walked into my room and let out a soft meow. I turned to wake up my mum, telling her something was wrong. In the 3 or 4 seconds it took her to sit up and ask me what was going on, we both turned back to the doorway and froze. A man was standing in the hallway, just outside my bedroom door, making his way out of my room. I don't know how she moved so quickly, but my mum grabbed me and threw me out the window screen and all. Thankfully, we were on the first floor, and it was only about a 3-foot drop to the ground. She immediately followed and started screaming for help. A neighbor called 911, and the police arrived shortly after. They didn't find any signs of forced entry, but our front door was unlocked. The police assumed the man must have left that way, but my mum swore up and down that she had locked the door with both the deadbolt and the chain lock. Before we went to bed, a week later, my mum was cleaning the kitchen and opened the water heater closet. Inside, she found a notebook filled with names and drawings, a pair of gloves, and some gum wrappers. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks. Man had been hiding in our apartment, waiting until we were asleep. Story 2. For me, it's the story of the guy camping in the deep forests of Canada who felt like he was being watched. He didn't think much of it until he got home and found a picture of himself sleeping on his camera. My friends and I read that creepypasta during a sleepover in junior high. Let's just say we were sufficiently freaked out, especially since my friend's house had these massive floor-to-ceiling windows and a large glass sliding door with no blinds. They had just moved in and hadn't gotten around to covering them yet. To make it worse, the house backed up to the woods. We were a bunch of terrified 12-year-olds with overactive imaginations. We talked about the story for a while and eventually convinced ourselves it was fake. After all, it was just a stupid story on the internet, right? Satisfied, we turned off the computer and went back to playing video games and watching TV, before falling asleep. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up thirsty and went to get a drink. On my way back, I noticed my friend's computer facing the area where we were sleeping was on. I could have sworn we turned it off. Curious, I walked over, logged in, and froze. The background of the computer was a picture of us sleeping. I lost it. I screamed loud enough to wake everyone up. My friends crowded around me, and we were all freaking out. Then someone noticed our phones weren't where we'd left them. One of my friends tried calling her parents to pick her up, because she was so scared. But we found the phones sitting on the table by the TV. We picked them up, only to discover the backgrounds on all of our phones were pictures of us sleeping. We screamed again so loud it probably woke the whole neighborhood. That's when we heard someone laughing. It was my friend's older brother. He came downstairs, absolutely losing it at how terrified we were. Turns out, He had overheard us talking about the story earlier and decided to mess with us. He'd taken our phones while we were asleep and changed the backgrounds. Still freaked out, but starting to calm down, we asked him about the computer. That's when things got weird. He looked genuinely confused and swore he hadn't touched it. He didn't even know the password to log on. Plus, the webcam on it was brand new, and he had no idea how to use it. Now he was freaked out, and we all started panicking again. That's when we heard another laugh. My friend's dad came downstairs, tears streaming down his face from laughing so hard. Turns out, he had snuck down after the brother saw what he'd done and decided to take it one step further by changing the computer background himself. Needless to say, none of us slept that night. But in hindsight, it's one of the funniest and creepiest sleepovers I've ever had. Story 3. I've read about serial killers quite a lot. I find the subject fascinating, and I'm usually not affected by the grisly details. Of course, I feel immense sadness for the victims and their loved ones, but the gore and depravity don't typically bother me. Dahmer, Chikatilo, Gein, Fish. I've read about them all in detail and remained detached. But there's one killer who truly disturbed me: Dean Corll. Corll was America's most prolific serial killer before Ted Bundy claimed that grim title. Yet he isn't as widely known. The more I read about him, the more horrified I became. The short version of his story is that he was a seemingly normal guy in his younger years. There were hints of repressed homosexuality, but nothing that pointed to the monstrous acts he would later commit. Over several years, Corll groomed and paid to teenage boys to recruit their friends, and when they ran out, other boys from the neighborhoods where he lived, he would lure these boys to his home, where he tied them to a torture board. There he subjected them to unimaginable horrors: abuse, rape, mutilation, and ultimately death. Corll disposed of the bodies in various locations, including a boat shed, and the police didn't connect the large number of missing boys to one perpetrator for years. His methodical nature and ability to avoid detection for so long make him even more chilling. What really shook me wasn't just Corll's actions, it was the callousness of the two boys he recruited. They were teenagers, sending boys their own age kids from their social circles and schools to their deaths for money. Worse, they assisted Corll in torturing his victims and disposing of their bodies, seemingly unfazed by the atrocities they were committing. Eventually, one of the boys brought a girl to Corll. This enraged him. He was terrified she might expose him, and he set about killing her. For reasons unclear, the boy must have had some attachment to her, because he ended up shooting and killing Corll to protect her. That's how Corll's reign of terror came to an end, not by the hands of law enforcement, but by a teenage accomplice. What makes Corll even more terrifying to me is that he was never caught, never put on trial, and never made to face justice for his crimes. He was never photographed in a jumpsuit or analyzed by psychologists who could label him as deeply disturbed. There's no explanation, no logic, no insights into what drove him, just the haunting, brutal reality of what he did. For me, this lack of closure makes him feel less human and more like a boogeyman who operated beyond the reach of the law or reason. I think that's why he unsettled me more than any other serial killer I've read about. I remember stumbling across a detailed article about Corll that went beyond the information available on his Wikipedia page. It included chilling Polaroid photos of some of his victims' young boys, bound to the torture board, awaiting their horrific, untimely ends. Those images stayed with me, and I wouldn't recommend looking them up unless you have an exceptionally strong stomach. Story 4. An ex-boyfriend of mine, an Iraqi Kurd, once told me a chilling story about a camping trip in the woods near Erbil in northern Iraq. It sounded like something straight out of a horror movie. He and a few friends decided to skip school on a Thursday, the day before the weekend in the Middle East, and go camping. They left their phones at home to avoid being tracked by their parents, who thought they were at school. The woods they chose to camp in were shrouded in local rumors. The story goes that some of the survivors of Saddam Hussein's chemical attacks, people left with severe birth defects, were banished to live in those woods. Over the years, there were reports of flesh-stripped human corpses being found in cabins there, and even the authorities refused to enter. It was a place of whispered horrors. They arrived at the woods, parked their car on the road at the base of a hill, and set up camp. Like any group of teenage boys, they started trying to scare each other, retelling the chilling local legends about these so-called mutants. As night fell, the atmosphere shifted. They began to hear whispering in the trees and the sound of twigs snapping. Fear set in, and they retreated into their tent, letting the fire burn out on its own. As the fire died, the voices outside grew louder. Terrified, they huddled together in silence. They could hear people lure something rummaging through their belongings outside the tent. It sounded like more than a dozen individuals. Then, one of the voices spoke. "Should we see who's in the tent?" Another replied, "Leave them." Frozen in fear, they stayed inside the tent, unable to call for help without their phones. When dawn finally broke, they emerged to find their camp completely destroyed. Their money and electronics were untouched, but all the food, cooking pots, and some clothing were gone. As they tried to piece together what had happened, a lone woman appeared, walking slowly down the hill toward them. She had no fingers and was wrapped in shredded fabric. That was enough to send them bolting downhill toward their car. When my ex reached a stream at the bottom, he stopped briefly to cross it and saw something that froze him in his tracks. A young girl, squatting in the river. She had no hair, no nose, and one of her eyes was missing. She stared at him, then let out a piercing scream. Fearing she would alert the others, he ran as fast as he could. When he reached the car, his friends were already waiting for him. But the car had been raided, and the keys were still back at the camp. With no other choice, they started walking until they managed to hitch a ride. Months later, an Austrian film crew reportedly fled the same forest in terror. According to their account, they had discovered a cabin filled with human remains, bodies that had been filleted and were wearing police and military uniforms. Even now, the thought of that story gives me chills. Story 5. About 2 years ago, I read a chilling story about a man who posted an ad on Craigslist claiming to own a legitimate production company and looking to cast actors for an indie horror film. Several aspiring actors replied to the ad, showed up for the casting, and began working with him. At first, they thought he was just eccentric, but as the days went on, his behavior became increasingly erratic and unsettling. One by one, the actors quit, realizing something wasn't quite right. Undeterred, the man shifted his approach and posted a personal ad on Craigslist, posing as a woman looking for a casual fling. He struck up an email exchange with a local young man, luring him into meeting at her house. When the young man arrived, he texted that he was outside. The woman replied, inviting him to enter through the open garage door, while she finished getting ready. As soon as he stepped inside, the garage door slammed shut behind him. Before he could react, someone knocked him unconscious. When the man woke up, he found himself strapped to a table in a setting eerily reminiscent of a Dexter-style kill room. A camera was pointed at him, and an assortment of knives and tools were laid out nearby. Somehow, he managed to escape after several terrifying hours or possibly days, but he didn't report the incident to the police immediately, too embarrassed and shaken to come forward. When he finally did, the police launched an investigation. They questioned the man behind the Craigslist ads and discovered a deeply disturbing history of mental illness. In his room, they found a journal filled with graphic and detailed entries about how he fantasized about killing people. Among the entries was a description of a man strapped to a table in a garage, eerily matching the young man's story. The man claimed it was all just material for a movie he wanted to make. As the investigation continued, authorities uncovered even more horrifying evidence. A young woman, believed to have responded to another of his Craigslist casting ads, was found dead in a trash can near his neighbor's property. I've been trying to find out what happened next. Was he convicted? There was a Dateline special about the case, but I can't seem to locate more information. If anyone knows or remembers this story, I'd love to hear more about it. Story 6. A couple of years ago, my best friend and I went on a road trip to the States for a music festival. We had a great time meeting up with friends and seeing the sights. On the way back, one of our friends decided to hitch a ride with us since he needed to get home for school, while his buddies stayed behind. We decided to drive straight through in shifts, a grueling 24-hour journey. I was driving the night shift at around 2 a.m. It was a stunningly clear night full moon, no clouds, the kind of night that makes everything feel a little surreal. As we drove, I realized we'd followed the GPS onto a back road and were descending into a massive, isolated valley. There were no other cars, no houses, and no signs of human activity for hours. Soon after entering the valley, we lost all signals, no GPS, no satellite radio, no cell service. It wasn't a huge deal since I knew we were supposed to stay on this road for a while longer. About 20 minutes later, we approached a bridge. Off to the side of the road was a car. At first, I assumed it was abandoned or someone was sleeping inside. But as we got closer, I noticed the windows were completely blacked out. With the bright moonlight, we should have been able to see something inside, but it was pitch black. Stranger still, there was no license plate. Just as we passed the car, its headlights turned on, and it pulled onto the road behind us. At first we brushed it off. Maybe the driver was lost and following us out of the area, but something didn't sit right. The windows, the missing plate, and the way they were tailgating us. It all felt off. My unease quickly escalated into a full-on fight-or-flight instinct. Get away from this vehicle, now. As I tried to dismiss the growing panic, I noticed something in the road ahead. The car behind us slowed down, almost as if it knew we'd spotted it. My heart was racing as I squinted to make out the object in the middle of the road. As we got closer, it became clear it looked like a body lying across both lanes. My stomach dropped. There was no way I was stopping. There were no houses, no other vehicles, and absolutely no way to call for help. I told my passengers, who were now fully awake and equally terrified, I'm not stopping. I'm driving around or through it. But as we approached, we realized there was no room to maneuver. The road was too narrow and deep ditches flanked both sides. We braced ourselves as I drove over it, and we heard nothing. As it turned out, it was a scarecrow. But one of my friends swore they saw spikes sticking out of it. The car behind us, small enough to go around the scarecrow, continued its pursuit. If I sped up, it sped up. If I slowed down, it slowed down. Eventually, I floored it, and after a couple of tense minutes, the car finally backed off, did a U-turn, and disappeared into the darkness. We didn't stop until we were back in an area with cell service, nearly 30 minutes later. It wasn't until we got home at 5 a.m. that we remembered hearing about several missing persons in our province vacationers, driving back from the States who never made it home. To this day, we firmly believe we narrowly avoided becoming their next victims. We did contact the police and filed a full report, though we couldn't pinpoint the exact location. There wasn't much they could do, but we felt it was important to report it. I'll never forget that night. It was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. Story 7. The Smiling Man. Creepy as hell. No violence, no drugs, no sex, nothing grotesque, just pure, unnerving weirdness. I once encountered something eerily similar to the figure described in the Smiling Man post. This thing always wore the most unsettling smile. It stretched across its face in a way that didn't seem natural, and it never faltered. Its eyes were wide, piercing, and unblinking. The smile and those eyes felt like they were staring straight through you. no matter where you were. And then there was the dancing. He didn't just walk like a regular person. No, he danced. His movements were strange, almost hypnotic. He kept his hands in front of him, moving them in this odd, Mr. Miyagi wax-on, wax-off motion, all while hopping from one foot to the other in an unsettling rhythm. But what really stood out, what made this whole encounter feel like it was straight out of a nightmare, was how he was dressed. He wore a large, round hat that always seemed to cast his face in shadow, no matter how much light there was. The shadow made the whites of his eyes stand out even more, giving him this ghostly, otherworldly appearance. And the rain? Every single time I saw him, it was raining. Always. He seemed to thrive in it, almost like he loved it maybe, even like he was calling it down with some kind of bizarre rain dance. To this day, the image of him haunts my dreams. That ridiculous, unrelenting smile, the unblinking eyes, and his strange, jerking dance moves. Once, I worked up the courage to take a picture of him. I just needed someone else to see it, to confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I wanted someone else to share in the terror of what I'd seen, even if it was just for a moment. Story 8. It's a pretty obscure story, but deeply disturbing in a "this could absolutely happen to you" kind of way. It's known as the FFVII house and is recounted from the perspectives of 4 or 5 different victims. Back in the early 2000s, a disturbed woman and her partner created a Final Fantasy VII role-playing forum. On the surface, it appeared to be just a normal fan community, but in reality, they used it to lure insecure teens back to their house. Once there, the woman used every manipulative, cult-like technique imaginable to isolate these teens from their families. She convinced them to participate in bizarre and dangerous rituals, often relating to in-game Final Fantasy lore, and manipulated one victim into draining their bank account of $50,000. She then spent the money entirely on cheap wicker and occult paraphernalia, such as crystal balls and dragon statues. As the stories progress, the woman's behavior becomes increasingly unstable. She began having violent outbursts and claimed that the spirits of FFVII characters appeared to her, commanding her to carry out unhinged actions. The accounts from the victims are often interwoven, creating a long but deeply satisfying read. It paints a chilling picture of how someone can use fandom, manipulation, and fantasy to completely control and exploit others. The intro to one of the survivors' accounts sets a tone. This all went down several years ago, starting with innocent internet friendships and spiraling completely out of control into something that most normal people would find wholly unbelievable. Once I escaped the loonies, I decided to write up my experiences and share them with the net. Almost immediately, other survivors of this group of nutcases began to send in their stories as well. Naturally, the people who ran this Fantasyland cult were unhappy. They deleted live journals, accused everyone involved of lying, and even claimed I invented it all because I was on drugs. Despite knowing I wasn't, they claimed that personal accounts written were not true, while in the same breath attacking the people who had not written them. They hopped fandoms from Final Fantasy to Hellsing, The Incredibles, and Heroes, and even moved states. But they have never been able to shake the fact that they very obviously did these things, and people have gotten sick of staying quiet about it. Everything here is true. Everything is 100% real. Some names were changed to protect the identities of those involved, but that is all. Everything else is 100% accurate. If you enjoy weeb stories, this is one of the wildest, creepiest ones in internet history. It's worth the read, but prepare yourself, it's truly unsettling. Story 9. This will likely get buried, but it stands as the most terrifying night of my life, not just because I was scared out of my mind, but because it could have been much, much worse. I was living in Koreatown, Los Angeles, being pretty broke and wanting independence from a string of awful roommates. it was the best option for me at the time. The location was convenient, close to Hollywood, downtown, where I often worked, and the subway line, since I didn't own a car. The building itself was a mix of immigrant families, college students, and starving artists. I was familiar with most of my neighbors' faces and knew who lived there. There were the usual cholo kids who hung out in front, sometimes tagged the dumpsters, and occasionally got shaken down by the cops for pot or stealing bikes. But they weren't the kind of threat that made you fear for your life. One of them was even a budding artist, and I'd give him extra pencils and paper when I could. Despite the area's reputation, I felt relatively safe. My apartment was on the 4th floor of an old brick building. You needed a key to get in, and unless someone was Spider-Man, there was no way to access the fire escape from the street. I lived alone in a tiny studio. For a few nights leading up to this, I had 2 male friends staying over. One had just been evicted, and the other was a close friend. On this particular Friday night, around 10:30 p.m., we decided to skip the usual weekend outing and watch a movie instead. By 11:30, we were winding down when I noticed footsteps in the hallway outside my door. The hallway lights were always on, bright and fluorescent, and my apartment was at the very end, right next to the fire escape. Residents often used it for smoke breaks, myself included, but this pacing didn't have the feel of a quick cigarette trip. Whoever it was, their steps were slow, deliberate. Then, the figure stopped directly in front of my door. From my mattress on the floor, I could see the shadow they cast through the crack at the bottom of the door. It was enormous, blocking out most of the hallway light. Then, the doorknob jiggled. By this point, my friends and I were frozen in fear. The lights in my apartment were off, making it seem like no one was home, or at least I hoped that was how it looked. Suddenly, there was thunderous knocking. Boom, boom, boom. "John, I know you're in there." The voice was deep, heavy, and unfamiliar. It sounded angry. Worse, it knew my name. Justin, one of my friends, quietly walked to the kitchen and grabbed a knife from the drawer. We stayed completely still, more knocking. The doorknob jiggled again. Then, we heard a scratching sound, like a pick or tool being worked into the keyhole. My heart was pounding. The only thing keeping us safe was my regular lock, the chain, and the deadbolt. Thank God they held it. We didn't dare call the police, for fear that the sound might alert whoever was out there. Instead, we sat in silence, listening to the jiggling, the scratching, and the heavy breathing. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, too terrified to stay awake any longer. The next morning, I opened the door to find ashes and about 4 cigarette butts on the ground. Whoever had been there wasn't just trying to get in, they had waited, likely staking out my apartment. If I had come home late or opened the door, who knows what could have happened. Robbery, rape, murder. All of those things were possibilities in that area. I stayed in that apartment for 4 more months, but I was never visited again. I asked the Cholo boys out front if they had seen anything. They told me they'd spotted 5 unfamiliar men hanging around outside the building that night. Even now, years later, the memory still sends shivers down my spine. Story 10. This is not my story, but one shared by a former classmate from Labrador in eastern Canada. It takes place just outside a larger town in the early 1900s. A family of 10 lived on the outskirts of this town: mother, father, their daughter, and a mix of siblings and extended family. The daughter, like many children, would play outside during the day, while the adults tended to their chores. She usually stayed close to home, but one day, perhaps while picking berries, she wandered a little farther than usual. While she was playing, she heard the sound of snapping twigs. Thinking it might be her family or an animal, she stayed put. Then, a figure emerged from the wood stall, hairy and with unnaturally long arms. As it came closer, another similar creature appeared behind it. They both grinned, their expressions eerie and unnatural, like something out of a nightmare. Think of the gentleman from Buffy the Vampire Slayer, but covered in fur. The creatures began chasing the girl. She ran, screaming for help, all the way back to her house. Her father and the other men in the family grabbed their guns and sent the dogs after the creatures, managing to drive them away. A few nights later, the girl was playing indoors, while her mother worked in the kitchen nearby. The rest of the family was gathered in other parts of the house. Suddenly, something made the girl glance at the window. There, staring back at her, was the grinning face of one of the creatures. She screamed, and the family rushed upstairs to safety as the dogs went wild outside. The creatures began banging on the exterior walls and the door. By morning, the family found deep gashes clawed into the sides of the house and the door. These incidents became a regular occurrence. The family was terrorized for years, with the creatures returning intermittently, until one day, the family simply vanished. Townsfolk assumed they had moved away, likely fed up with the relentless wild animal attacks. Years later, my classmate, who grew up near where the family had lived, heard this story and decided to check out the house. As expected, it was in ruins, having been abandoned for more than 50 years. But what stood out were 10 unmarked graves around the back of the property. The creature from this story is now known locally as the Traverse Spine Sasquatch. Some details may have shifted over time, but the story remains a chilling piece of local lore. If you're curious, a bit of research will pull up more about this strange and terrifying tale. Story 11. A friend of mine once rented a farm in northern Ohio. It was the perfect spot for us to hang out, drink, and partake in certain less than legal activities. Rumor had it that the farm was owned by a cocaine dealer in the 70s, but we didn't think much of it. At first, it was just a creepy old farm, nothing more until the weird things started happening. The farmhouse itself was perched on a hill. It looked like it had been trapped in the 1970s, dingy and outdated, but with a bit of work, it became our party spot. There was a cellar door on the side of the house that led to what we called the murder basement. It was dark, damp, and downright horrifying, so we avoided it. There was also a sauna, which we used for smoking and steaming, and a hot tub that was a definite no-go. None of us were brave enough to even attempt using it. At first, it was just small, unsettling things. One night, we heard a loud thud like someone had thrown something against the house. We rushed out to investigate, but found nothing and no one. Then a sick feeling crept over me, and I said, "What about the cellar door?" None of us wanted to check. The next day, we mustered up the courage. When we peeked into the cellar, we saw light coming from inside the house. A narrow crawl space at the top of the basement wall had an opening leading to the bathroom. We moved some stuff around in the bathroom and found a wooden hatch, an escape tunnel. That was when things got serious. We knew someone had been there, maybe, still was. The farm was massive, with 6 buildings, a single garage, a carport, a little barn, a big barn, a long barn, and the farmhouse. The garage held a pristine, red 1972 Porsche. The carport was filled with about 20 old beat-up vehicles. The big barn was pretty typical farm equipment and animal pens, but the little barn was packed with random junk. And then there was the long barn. That place was strange. Inside the long barn, we found piles of vinyl records worth thousands of dollars, clothes that looked too nice to be left behind, and even a refrigerator door still full of condiments. Everything in there felt like someone had left in a hurry. Behind the long barn, in the woods, we discovered something even stranger. The remains of a burned-down church, dating back to the 1880s. Only the chimney was left standing. One night, we had a big bonfire near the big barn. By then, we'd assumed that a squatter, maybe a hobo, had been living there, but had fled because of our constant partying. At some point, we needed more wood for the fire. The barn had plenty, but it was pitch black inside. So, we used my car's headlights and rigged up a makeshift torch to light our way. I was on edge the whole time, trying to act tough. I shouted into the darkness, "Hey, hobo. If you come near us, I'll stick this knife in you." And then we heard it. Above USFT, feet in the air on the massive support beams holding up the roof, we heard heavy footsteps, boots, clear as day. Someone was walking along those beams in the dark. We froze. Then we bolted, screaming as we ran back to the fire. Later, after arming ourselves, we searched the barn from top to bottom. Nothing. No sign of anyone. We kept going back to the farm for a few weeks after that, but I eventually decided I'd had enough. I never went back. To this day, I have no idea who or what was walking up there. Maybe it was a Vietnam vet who'd gone off the grid, or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, I wasn't sticking around to find out. Story 12. In the fall of 2008, my friends and I decided to explore the forest preserve near my neighborhood. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other. Our house was in one of the older neighborhoods, bordering an expansive forest preserve. It was one of those places that already had an eerie feel, with its dense woods and sprawling prairies. We were freshmen in high school, and with nothing better to do, we thought it would be fun to wander into the forest at night. It was just before 9 p.m. when the four of us, 3 girls and 1 boy, set out. The closest entrance was the old one, marked by 2 weathered brick columns, a dim fluorescent lamp on a wooden post, and a dirt parking lot. The whole scene felt like something out of a horror movie. We walked into the forest without flashlights, letting our eyes adjust to the darkness. It was pitch black, the kind of dark that makes every sound seem louder and every shadow look suspicious. The trail started out as a simple dirt path and eventually turned into gravel, spiraling down into a ravine. About halfway down, I started to feel uneasy. I didn't say anything at first, but the idea of continuing deeper suddenly felt wrong. To lighten the mood, or maybe to scare my friends into heading back, I quietly picked up a rock and tossed it into the ravine. The noise was loud and echoed ominously through the forest. My friends screamed and bolted back toward the entrance. I followed, laughing, and admitted it was me. 2 of the girls were annoyed, but my best friend sided with me, agreeing it was probably best to head home. As we got closer to the edge of the forest, I could see the faint flicker of the street lamp near the parking lot. My best friend and I were walking ahead, talking, while the other 2 trailed behind, still in the woods. Just as we stepped out of the trees and into the tall prairie grass that bordered the parking lot, we heard a loud crack, like a branch snapping, coming from the prairie to our right. We both froze. My friend turned her back to the prairie, looking at me, but my eyes were locked on the source of the noise over her shoulder. I'll never forget what I saw. Towering above the tall grass, about 10 feet away, was a creature unlike anything I'd ever seen. Its eyes were the first thing I noticed. Large, black, almond-shaped, and staring directly at me. It had 2 large, pointed ears and a slit nose. Its head looked like a grotesque combination of a German shepherd and a moose, perched on an upright body. I couldn't move, and my friend froze too when she turned to see it. Then we both screamed. The creature whipped around and bounded away into the tall grass, disappearing into the darkness. Without thinking, I ran faster than I ever had before, straight for the street. Collapsing against one of the brick columns at the entrance, I was shaking and crying uncontrollably. My best friend followed, pale and speechless. A minute later, our other 2 friends emerged from the forest, confused and oblivious. They didn't believe us when we told them what we saw, thinking it was another prank. I protested, but I couldn't stand to stay there any longer, so we hurried back to my house. That night, my best friend and I tried to make sense of what we'd seen. The closest match we found online was the Legend of the Beast of Bray Road, which looked eerily similar to what we'd encountered. We swore we'd never go back to that forest preserve, and we didn't. To this day, neither of us knows what we saw. We both described the same thing, those haunting black eyes, the strange ears, the way it moved. I grew up in the woods and have seen plenty of wildlife. Bears, wolves, cougars. This wasn't any of those. Whatever it was, it made me a believer in the unexplained. I'll never forget those eyes. Story 12. I'm writing this now because it was around this time of year, a few years ago, that my husband bought the house we live in now. Being first-time homebuyers, there were certain things we focused on: making sure it had enough closet and storage space, checking if the rooms were the right size, and ensuring the yard had the fence and landscaping we wanted. Like most buyers, we completed a home inspection to make sure everything was safe and up to code. We asked the usual questions. How old is the house? What are the property taxes? But one question that never crossed our minds was, what might have previously happened in this house? That is, until we moved in and started exploring the place more thoroughly. Our biggest must-have was a basement. My husband wanted a space to play his drums and set up an entertainment area. When we toured the house, we briefly checked the basement to confirm it was spacious enough. We didn't pay much attention to the smaller details at the time. It wasn't until we started moving in and setting up his drums that we noticed strange and unsettling things lurking below. The first oddity we discovered was a metal track running across the length of the basement ceiling. Hanging from the track was a metal hook with a pair of handcuffs attached. We found it strange, but brushed it off, figuring the previous owners had questionable hobbies. We didn't want to dwell on it. But then, my husband noticed something else. He called out to me from the basement, his voice tense and disturbed. "What the hell happened down here? You need to come see this." I rushed downstairs to find him standing there, pale and visibly shaken. He pointed to a pole in the middle of the room, and etched into the surface were the words, "Let me die." The words looked like they had been scratched into the metal, possibly with a fingernail or a small sharp object. The sight of it sent chills down my spine. And that wasn't all. Scattered across various parts of the basement were other similar phrases, scratched into walls and surfaces. "Help me. Save me." The creepiest discovery was in the small, dark utility room where the hot water heater is located. There, etched into the wall, was "Help me." The words stared back at us, filling the tiny, claustrophobic space with an eerie sense of despair. To this day, we don't know what happened in that basement. The hook with the handcuffs, the haunting phrases, none of it made sense. Was it a cry for help? A terrible event? We'll likely never know. I refuse to go down there alone, and even when someone is home, I can't shake the feeling of unease every time I step into that space. The moral of this story is simple. There are some things you can't discover about a house until you move in. Some questions, like the one we neglected to ask, may not even occur to you. What happened here before? If the house's history wasn't connected to a crime or legal issue, there's no record of it. But if you're buying a house with a basement or attic, take a closer look at the details, every nook, every cranny before making an offer. Because some discoveries, once made, can never be forgotten. Story 14. A man was walking through the forest when darkness began to fall much quicker than he had anticipated. As the light faded, he found himself disoriented and hopelessly lost. After wandering aimlessly, he stumbled upon a small, isolated cabin nestled among the trees. Hoping for shelter, he knocked on the door but received no response. Out of desperation, he tried the handle. It was unlocked. The cabin appeared empty, its interior barren and silent. Assuming it to be an abandoned hunting cabin, the man decided to stay the night and leave at first light. He made his way to the bedroom, a sparsely furnished space with only a bed at its center. But as he stepped inside, his skin prickled with unease. The room was filled with portraits. They lined every wall, hanging side by side, all facing the bed. Each portrait depicted a face, but these were no ordinary faces. They were twisted, demented, and grotesque eyes, burning with hatred, mouths contorted in scowls. Their expressions seemed almost alive, filled with malice, glaring directly at the bed where the man now stood. He wanted to leave, but the exhaustion of his journey weighed on him heavily. As unnerved as he was, he reasoned that the faces were just paintings and settled into the bed. It took a long time for sleep to come. Even as he closed his eyes, those hideous, hateful faces lingered in his mind, their glares seared into his memory. When dawn finally arrived, sunlight spilled into the room, waking the man. He sat up slowly, dreading the sight of those terrible portraits. But as his eyes adjusted to the morning light, he froze in horror. There were no portraits on the walls, only windows. Story 15. This didn't happen online, but was something a friend told me about, something really messed up. We were hanging out backstage at a school play we were in. The area around the theater is known for being full of homeless people and abandoned buildings. Apparently, a group of my friends had decided to explore one of those buildings, an old abandoned school called Public School Number 4. They wandered around for a while, exploring the creepy old halls, and eventually made their way down to the basement. After a bit, some of them started getting creeped out and annoyed by how dark it was, so they decided it was time to leave. As they were heading out, one of them snapped a picture of the basement with their phone, just for kicks. Later, we were all backstage, laughing about their little adventure and all the stupid things they did while exploring the school. That's when they pulled out the picture and started passing it around. At first, we were just talking about how creepy the place looked, but then, one of my friends noticed something strange. In the dim, grainy photo, amidst a couple of bright spots from their flashlight, there was a faint outline of a man. He was just standing there in the dark, barely visible, holding what looked like a pipe. We all stared at the photo in stunned silence. I haven't gone near an abandoned building since, and I don't think I ever will. And that wraps up tonight's dive into the spine-chilling stories from the depths of the internet. If these tales left you feeling unsettled, or if you're still questioning what's real, don't forget to subscribe to Panda's Nightmares for more haunting content. Hit the like button, follow for updates, and be sure to check out my other videos for even more eerie and unsettling stories. And one more thing, if you can, please consider supporting my dad's medical treatment through the GoFundMe link in the description. Your support truly means the world to me. Thank you for watching, and remember, the scariest stories are the ones that might just be true. Stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.